The House will be in order. The prayer will be offered by Chaplain Gibbon.
Would you pray with me? Holy One, we come before you, resolved and refocused, to attend to the business before us. We pray for all that transpired last week, that you have blessed what was good, the unity of purpose, the collegial ministrations, the common commitment to this country. Will you also forgive what fell short? Need we list all our transgressions? As we stand here, our iniquities, personal and corporate, are ever before us. Your judgment of us would be justified. We pray your mercy. And now, as we move forward, bless the work that lies before us. Only by your grace will we be able to confront the myriad of challenges we are sure to face in the days, months, and years ahead. O Lord, abide with us always, in the good, the bad, and the challenging. For all things are subject to your authority, and with you to strengthen us, we can accomplish and be content in the work you have called us to do. We offer this prayer in your most holy name. Amen.
The chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House the approval thereof. The Pledge of Allegiance will be led by the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Everyone is invited at the first historic presiding by Speaker Kevin McCarthy to say the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I like this view. Is he on a...
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, the Majority Leader, Mr. Scalise.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a privileged resolution at the desk and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Resolution 5, resolution adopting the
Unanimous consent that the resolution be considered read and printed in the record.
Without objection, the reading is considered as read. Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 1 hour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield the remainder of my time to my friend from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole, the chairman of the Rules Committee, and ask unanimous consent that he be permitted to control the time.
Without objection, the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole, will control the time.
I thank my good friend, the distinguished Majority Leader, Mr. Scalise, for yielding. Mr. Speaker, for the purpose of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts, my good friend, Mr. McGovern, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
During consideration of this resolution, all time is yielded for the purpose of debate only. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I also ask unanimous consent to include in the record a section-by-section analysis of the resolution.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to my good friend, the Majority Leader, Mr. Scalise.
Gentleman from Louisiana, the Majority Leader, Mr. Scalise, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, thank my friend from Oklahoma for yielding. And Mr. Speaker, we are here to discuss the rules of the House, actually debating the rules package. And why this is so important is because this lays out the ability for the House to conduct business, for the House to not only conduct business, but for the House to address the problems that the American people across this country is facing. And let's just be very clear up front. We saw a lot of debate about this last week. At the heart of all of this discussions last week was very clear, surely from our side, that Washington is broken. And not just is Washington broken, but the way that this House has been running for the last few years has not been designed to address the problems of the people across this country. In fact, we've seen many of the problems that families are facing across America created by the things that have come out of this Congress, signed by President Biden. Why is inflation running away? Because spending's out of control. Because bills appear by dark of night, bills that nobody's read that are thousands of pages long, where members aren't even allowed to give input in committee, on the floor, to address problems they know their constituents will face if these bills pass. And yet the bills are passed because they're written in rooms behind closed doors by a small number of people, not concerned about the consequences that will affect so many millions of people across this nation. Mr. Speaker, for a long time, we've been saying this needs to change. In fact, we ran on an agenda to change the way that Washington works, to fix this broken system, to get our country back on track, and we were awarded the majority by the people across this country. And so today starts that process of fixing what's broken in Washington so that Washington can finally start working for the people of this country who are struggling. And so let's start with one basic thing, is reopening the people's house. For years, the American people were shut out of coming and seeing their government work. In fact, with proxy voting, which, by the way, ends in this rules package, members of Congress have to show up and work again. Just look at the bill that passed a few weeks ago, the omnibus spending bill. $1.7 trillion, mostly borrowed from countries like China. You look at all of the things that had absolutely nothing to do with the general operations of government that were thrown in that. Now, you can start looking at it today, but you surely couldn't look at it the day of the vote because very few people had the opportunity to read it. Over 4,000 pages dumped by dark of night right before the vote. And yes, a majority of this Congress voted by proxy on that bill. They weren't even here showing up to vote. Well, you know what? Americans all across the country have to show up to vote. They have to go to their work site. They can't work remotely. In fact, Congress doesn't work virtually. It's just not set up that way.
And yet that's what we've seen the last 2 years. Committees that don't even meet in person. There are some committees that haven't had an in-person hearing for 2 years. We end that practice in this rules package, where committees actually have to get to work again, not only meeting in person, but in some cases going out into the field, going into the real world. Places like the border between the United States and Mexico, where, yes, despite the president's claim, there is a crisis at the border. And we've been talking about it for a long time. We've been trying to bring legislation, but that legislation's been rejected by a top-down structure. This rules package changed that so where we can finally start bringing bills to the floor to address things like the border crisis, to finally start addressing inflation and runaway spending. If a member of Congress has an idea and they want to bring an amendment to the floor, for so long they were shut out of that ability. You had a bill that was over $4 trillion in spending and taxes that was brought through multiple committees in Congress, and not one amendment was allowed to be brought forward and passed. In fact, even the majority was told in the committees, don't allow a single amendment to pass on a bill dealing with trillions of dollars in taxes and spending that is crushing families across America. So let's make Congress work for families again. Let's empower members of Congress to be able to represent their constituents. We were all elected by, on average, about 750,000 people. And for too long, each of members of Congress, Republican or Democrat, were denied the ability in so many different ways because the rules were structured to shut their ability down from representing their districts unless they were in a leadership position. That has to change, and under this rules package, that finally does change. So let's make this Congress work for the people who sent us here. We are, after all, the people's house. It's about time we start acting like it. Let's pass this rules package, get to work addressing the needs of the American people. I urge passage of this important piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole, for yielding me the customary 30 minutes, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, first let me congratulate our incredible new House Democratic leadership team, Hakeem Jeffries, Catherine Clark, Pete Aguilar. It's a dawn of a new day here in Congress as a new generation takes on the solemn responsibility of leadership. Leader Jeffries has been tireless in his work to put people over politics. His steady leadership as chair of our Democratic caucus, uniting our members, harnessing their talent and diversity, and fighting tirelessly to make life better for the American people is a source of inspiration to me and to so many others. It's also a privilege to be here with my good friend, Tom Cole, someone who I respect greatly and who I know greatly respects this institution. We sit on opposite ends of the dais, but I admire Tom's leadership and the example that he sets. And even when we don't see eye to eye, I'm proud of our work to build an atmosphere of respectful dialogue on the Rules Committee. We've done so not just among our members, but amongst our hardworking staff. And I want to thank our minority and majority staff, led by Don Sisson and Kelly Dixon, for all of their hard work. I look forward to working with Mr. Cole and his team of this Congress to continue our collaboration on issues of shared concern. Mr. Speaker, as Leader Jeffries put it so succinctly this weekend, our Republican friends campaigned on the claim that they would fight against inflation and fight for the American people. But instead, all they've done is come to Washington and fight with each other. In fact, what's become crystal clear over the past few days is the extent to which the Republican Party has been hijacked by an extremist MAGA faction, a faction not interested in governing, but in their own egos, a faction not interested in compromise, but in their own power, a faction not interested in putting people over politics, but instead interested in putting their own political ambition over the people we serve. Now here we are, nearly a week later, considering their deeply flawed rules package, the first legislation on the floor by this new majority, and they are using it to gut the Office of Congressional Ethics, attack women's access to abortion, make it easier for big oil companies to pollute, and interfere in ongoing criminal investigations into President Trump. They're making it easier for billionaires and big corporations to avoid paying their taxes. Is that part of their contract with America? Is that their big plan to help everyday people? because most people who read this package would think it must be a joke. And what I'm concerned about is not just what's written down here. I'm concerned by the backroom deals that Speaker McCarthy made with the Freedom Caucus in exchange for their votes. Like Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace said just this weekend, and I quote, "We don't have any idea what promises were made." This is unconscionable. We're only 1 week into this, and this is how they're running this place. There's a report out by Punchbowl News, and let me read it. It said there's also a secret 3-page addendum that McCarthy and his allies hashed out during several days of grueling negotiations with the House Freedom Caucus. This pact includes the most controversial concessions that McCarthy made in order to become Speaker. 3 seats on the Rules Committee for conservatives, freezing spending at FY 2022 levels, a debt ceiling strategy, coveted committee assignments, and more. Is this what the Majority Leader meant when he talked about a new day and transparency? You know, these rules are not a serious attempt at governing. They're essentially a ransom note to America from the extreme right. The same members of Congress who held this body hostage last week are the ones who ran interference for the January 6th insurrectionists who tried to overturn a free and fair election. And even the new Speaker of the House voted to overturn the 2020 elections. We couldn't even get a public acknowledgement from him on the 2-year anniversary of that horrific day, not even a tweet. It is clear that Republicans welcomed the election deniers into their ranks with open arms, and now they are reaping what they have sown. The insurrectionists are in charge. I'm reminded of the words of President Kennedy, and I quote, "In the past, those who foolishly sought power by riding the back of the tiger ended up inside," end quote. The American people get it. They rejected extremism in the last 2 elections. That's why they picked Joe Biden, and that's why the red wave turned into a pink splash. But my Republican friends still aren't listening, and in fact, they're still empowering the extremists. Don't take my word for it. Let's go through their rules package. They're giving a single member the ability to remove the Speaker at any time, letting a small far-right faction hold their leadership hostage. They're trying to shut down criminal investigations into the former president's wrongdoing. They are making it easier to slash taxes on billionaire corporations while dismantling the social safety net. They're giving committee chairs unbalanced discretion over which witnesses can testify, rejecting pandemic safety procedures like remote voting, and trying to force an end to the congressional staff unionization. And the icing on the cake? A new subcommittee to push QAnon conspiracies and launch fake investigations into non-existent scandals. What's next? A rule requiring we all wear tinfoil hats? This package is disrespectful not just to this institution, but to the people who sent us here to govern. I urge a no vote, and I reserve my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to begin by thanking my good friend from Massachusetts for his leadership of the Rules Committee over the last 4 years. While we certainly haven't always agreed, we've tried to always be agreeable working with one another. And I certainly associate myself with his remarks about the terrific work of the staff on both sides of the aisle for helping us facilitate the operation of the House over that 4-year period. I look forward again to working with my friend in the years ahead. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to offer the rules resolution that will govern the House during the 118th Congress. Determining the rules we will follow is one of the first and most consequential decisions we must make as a body at the beginning of each Congress. In many ways, the rules of the House of Representatives serve to demonstrate where our priorities and our values lie as an institution. And make no mistake, the priorities of the new Republican majority are fully on display in this resolution. First and foremost, Mr. Speaker, we're taking action to reopen the People's House and to ensure that we, the people, elected servants, are here in Washington, D.C. doing our jobs. For far too long, the House allowed members to do their jobs from home without ever setting foot in Washington. What started out as a pandemic accommodation lasted far longer than necessary. But today, even President Biden admits that the pandemic is over. It's time for the House of Representatives to return to our normal operating procedures, and it's time for the members of Congress to actually show up to work. Today's rule package eliminates proxy voting and puts an end to remote committee proceedings. We restore the requirement for committees to establish plans for how they will conduct much-needed oversight. Republicans have robust plans to ensure that we will hold the Biden administration accountable for its actions. But being a counterbalance to the administration will not stop there. With today's rule package, we will also establish a new select subcommittee modeled on the Church Committee to investigate the radical left's weaponization of the federal government in recent years. We will also modify the jurisdiction of the select subcommittee on the coronavirus pandemic to ensure we investigate the origins of the virus and finally look into the financial and societal impacts of shutdowns. And we will establish a select committee on strategic competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party to respond to threats posed by the CCP, ensure economic competitiveness for America, and protect human rights. Other important changes in this resolution are those that are designed to address our out-of-control spending problem, which the former majority made vastly worse last Congress. In fact, when Democrats were in control of this chamber, they spent so much money through partisan bills that they managed to drive this country into an inflationary crisis. But those aren't my words. Those are the words of former Clinton Treasury Secretary Larry Summers. The American people elected Republicans to get our fiscal house in order, and get our fiscal house in order we will. That starts with making key changes to House rules to ensure we still will instill some fiscal sanity in Congress. These changes reflect a return to budgetary rules that were in place for over a decade before Democrats removed them. We will restore the cut-go rule, which requires us to offset any increase in mandatory spending with a corresponding cut in mandatory spending. No more will the House be able to use budget gimmicks and tricks to pretend increases in mandatory spending are paid for when they actually are not. We will restore a requirement for 3/5 majority to approve any tax rate increase. If this rule had been in place, the House would not have passed the massive tax increases the Democrats included in last year's reconciliation bill. We will eliminate the so-called Gephardt rule, which allows the House to automatically suspend the debt ceiling upon passage of a budget resolution. Just as the American people have to live within their means, so too should the federal government. Automatically suspending the debt limit may be the easy and expedient way, but no matter as important as the national debt limit, what is easy and expedient is hardly appropriate. The American people expect us to make a decision on the national debt limit only after full and fair consideration and debate in the House. That starts with ensuring it will receive a separate standalone vote on the floor. Finally, we will remove the rule that allowed Democrats to simply ignore budget estimates for bills dealing with the COVID pandemic or climate change. Though it may sound controversial to my friends on the other side of the aisle, Republicans cannot and will not thrust our heads in the sand and ignore the effects of out-of-control federal spending. Mr. Speaker, I could go on and on, but on the whole, I am very proud of today's rules package. It reflects Republican priorities and priorities of the voters who elected us. It reopens this institution and ensures that all members will be in Washington to do their work as our constituents expect. It ensures that we will hold the Biden administration and the Chinese Communist Party accountable, and it ensures that we will get our fiscal house in order. I urge all members to support the rules package, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I request unanimous consent to insert into the record a Congressional Budget Office report from today entitled Estimated Budgetary Effects of H.R. 23, the Family and Small Business Taxpayer Protection Act, which basically says that the nonpartisan report says that the GOP's IRS funding bill will add $114 billion to the national debt. So when people talk about taking steps to reduce the national debt, I'm not sure what they're talking about.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, if we defeat the previous question, I will offer an amendment to the rule to bring up the Women's Health Protection Act, and I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of the amendment in the record immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection.
And to discuss our proposal, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California, Mrs. Chu.
The gentlelady from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Americans across the country have sent a resounding message at the ballot box. They support the right to access abortion and for people to have the basic freedom to make decisions about their own bodies with medical professionals and without the interference of extremist politicians. In every state where abortion was on the ballot, the American people called for freedom and bodily autonomy. And now, House Democrats' first action of the 118th Congress is to answer that call. If we defeat the previous question today, the House will take up my bill, the Women's Health Protection Act, which will guarantee abortion rights for everyone in every state. In the wake of the extremist Supreme Court's devastating decision last summer in Dobbs, Congress must stand up for the rights of every person to be able to make decisions about their own bodies and their own futures. House Democrats trust people, not politicians, to make decisions about their health and lives. I urge my colleagues to join me in defeating the previous question.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to my very good friend, the distinguished member from Texas, member of both the Rules Committee and Energy and Commerce Committee, Dr. Burgess.
Gentleman from Texas, recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And let me just say at the outset, Mr. Cole has had probably the hardest job in Washington the past 4 years. Being the ranking member of the Rules Committee is a difficult position. He's done it extremely well. So I know he is going to excel as the chairman of the Rules Committee during this term of Congress. But clearly, Mr. Speaker, the American public spoke with a clear voice. They want the nation to go in a new direction. They want a path away from tax and spend politics advanced by the Democrats in the last Congress. In this rules package, we've laid out how we intend to accomplish just that. The era of legislating for the few at the expense of the many is over. This new majority today begins a serious task in ways that will make this Congress more transparent, more accountable, and more accessible to the public and the members that serve the institution. This majority will implement voting procedures on the floor so that recorded votes can be conducted in a straightforward manner rather than what we have seen over the past 3 years that literally strands members of Congress on the floor for hours when they cannot do any other work in their committee or anywhere else. Mr. Speaker, I believe our friends in the outgoing and the previous Congress squandered their opportunity for focusing on the politics focusing on the politics of division instead of what we were all sent here to do, and that is the people's business. Tackle inflation, tackle lawlessness, the threats abroad. These are the urgent issues that the American public demands that their representatives address. And instead, Americans were treated to the petty and divisive agenda of the last Congress. Thankfully, Mr. Speaker, Republicans will utilize this majority. Republicans have proposed an agenda that will address these vital issues and put our nation back on the track to fiscal prosperity. With this Republican majority, we offer Americans a governing agenda that will ensure that the 21st century remains an American century. I yield back.
From Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, we heard a lot about inflation, but none of the 12 bills, the first 12 bills my Republican friends are bringing up have anything to do with inflation or mention inflation. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Gett.
Gentlelady from Colorado is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, if there was any overriding issue of clarity in the last election, it's that Americans feel strongly that they should have the freedom to make their own health care decisions, not politicians. Apparently, House Republicans weren't listening because just 2 months after a record number of Americans voted to vehemently oppose the GOP's efforts to criminalize abortion care in this country, we have today a set of rules that will make their extreme agenda a reality. These rules will pave the way for the immediate passage of not one, not two, but 3 bills that will limit women's rights to reproductive care. 25% of their initial agenda is anti-choice. This is not what the people want of America. 61% of this country strongly support a woman's right to abortion care. I urge all of my colleagues to stand up to this extremism and stand up for the people who we were elected to serve. Vote no on the previous question to bring up the Women's Health Protection Act, and vote no on the rule. Let's listen to our constituents. I yield back.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 3 minutes to the distinguished lady from Minnesota, my colleague on the Rules Committee, Ms. Fischbach.
Gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the chairman of the Rules Committee and my friend from Oklahoma for yielding me the time and for the experiences we've had on rules the last year. Mr. Speaker, for far too long, Democrats have run roughshod over the norms and practices of the People's House, weaponizing our rules to insulate themselves and protect their allies in the Biden administration from proper oversight. That ends today. I want to thank the chairman, Speaker McCarthy, and our leadership for spending countless hours putting together this package that better reflects the historical practices of this institution while receiving feedback to ensure the work we do is by the people and for the people. There are numerous items that I truly believe are vast improvements from the previous 2 years, but I will focus on 3. First and foremost, this package finally ends the ludicrous pandemic procedures that have done lasting, if not permanent, damage to this institution. Legislating requires us to see each other eye to eye in order to understand where the other is coming from. Remote proceedings and a lockdown capital have reduced this institution to a computer screen, and the work product has deteriorated as a result. It is long past time for us to get back to work. Second, the rules package finally creates a more transparent process by which we legislate. As then Chairman McGovern once said, a lousy process leads to bad legislating. Today, through a mandatory 72-hour rule, we allow more thoughtful and deliberate consideration that will improve what we pass out of this House. Finally, this rules package helps restore some fiscal sanity. Over the past 2 years, the American people have been hindered by out-of-control spending by the government, and now our constituents are saddled with trillions in debt and the highest inflation levels in a generation. House Republicans today will once again ensure the federal budget operates like any other, requiring offsets for any additional spending, eliminating budget gimmicks, and requiring inflationary analysis of the bills we consider. I am proud to stand by my friend and colleague from Oklahoma in support of this package, and I urge members to do the same. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, let me just remind my friends that over 1 million people, 1 million Americans died of COVID, including a member-elect who was supposed to be sworn in the last Congress. And these remote procedures undoubtedly saved lives of members and staff here in this chamber. So please, let's not diminish what the point of all that was about. I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Gentlelady from Washington is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After a week of chaos, we now have a rules package for MAGA extremists attacking our freedoms and every major responsibility of this body, from paying America's bills to funding our government. This package criminalizes abortion by advancing bills that attack access and health care without a single hearing or markup, undermining women's economic freedom and bodily autonomy. Mr. Speaker, as one of the 1 in 4 women across this country who have had an abortion, I join those in both parties and the majority of this country who are saying not on our watch. This package also reinstates a cut-go policy that gives wealthy corporations more tax cuts and strips the right for congressional workers to unionize. And it eliminates our wins to strengthen witness disclosure requirements for conflicts of interest and exempt climate change and pandemic relief from senseless pay-go rules. Democrats delivered for the people. Republicans now want a package that works for the wealthiest few. Vote no.
Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to my very good friend from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, who had so much to do with some of the extraordinary changes in this rule package. So I yield to the gentleman.
Gentleman from West Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I come to talk today about getting back to the basics. This place has, in fact, been broken, and a number of the rules that we worked on were to bring authority back and bring us back to the principles of Jefferson's parliamentary practice and procedure, his manual on that. So I would say to you, ladies and gentlemen, that we should look at that document for what its principles stand for. And what it stands for is, and it says right in the preamble, for some of the most familiar, Jefferson writes, for some of the most familiar and experienced members, referencing their members of Parliament, because that's what he based it upon, that nothing tended more to throw power into the hands of administration and those who acted with the majority in the House of Commons than neglect or departure from rules of proceedings, that these forms, as instituted by our ancestors, operate as a check and control on the actions of the majority, and they were in many instances a shelter and protection to the minority against the attempts of power. So when I go out there, Mr. Speaker, and ask that we change these rules to make sure that we have rules that help protect all members, including the minority members, you can imagine my surprise and shock today when I hear that they are opposed to rules that do some very basic things that the American people are going to be shocked that we don't already do, such as a single purpose, that you cannot introduce a bill that doesn't have a single purpose or theme to that bill. Now, it can be complicated, but it has to have an overarching theme, something that this bill is attempting to do right from the get-go, the sole purpose rule. And then there's the germaneness and coming up with a stricter germaneness interpretation, Mr. Speaker. And as we know, that also helps so that you don't end up happening like we had happen last summer, where somebody introduces a bill to mint a commemorative coin and it turns into the Inflation Reduction Act. That's absolutely ridiculous. Hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of pages came out of a one-paragraph bill. No, that's wrong. And this allows us, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, this allows us more power to say no on the floor by the individual members.
Yield the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding me that additional time. As you can tell, I get fired up about these issues. But the bottom line is this rules package is the best rules package of either party in a number of years, because instead of worrying about what might happen next week, this rules package worries about the future of the United States Congress. And it's a good package, and I wholeheartedly support it and yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you for yielding. Mr. Speaker, after 4 days and 15 rounds of the new Republican majority has finally chosen a speaker, and their first order of business is to trample on the hopes of the people that elected them. The rules package that we see before us contains no less than 3 bills that strip people in this country of their reproductive freedom. These bills are a slap in the face to voters who proved time and time again at the polls last year that they believe in reproductive freedom and abortion access. From Kentucky to Kansas to my home state of California, our constituents believe that the right to make decisions about their life and their health, including abortion, lies with them, not with you, not with me, not with any elected official. This rules package is meant to help this body govern, not restrict the personal autonomy of millions. As one who has had an abortion, I know how horrific this rule package is. It's our bodies, it's our choices. Mr. Speaker, this dysfunction and hypocrisy is shameful, and the people deserve better.
From Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to my good friend, distinguished gentleman from South Dakota, Mr. Johnson.
Gentleman from South Dakota is recognized for 3 minutes.
Quite a little bit of the national narrative over the last week has been about Republican disunity, and some have tried to apply that narrative to this rules package. And I get it, it makes for a good story, but it just isn't so. I rise today, Mr. Speaker, with a more accurate assessment. This rules package is actually about Republican unity. This package, except for one single change, is the same rules package that was released 2 weekends ago. This is the same rules package, except for one single change, that the Republican conference had widespread agreement on weeks ago. Now, there are a tremendous number of conservative wins here. At least 72 hours for members and the public to review legislation before we vote on it, requiring every bill to deal with only a single subject, getting rid of proxy voting, bringing back the Holman Rule, which will allow this body to target specific spending line items, and then the return of cut-go, so that spending increases have to be offset by spending reductions. Every single one of these big conservative wins, Mr. Speaker, and many more like them, were supported by the Republican conference long before the excitement of last week. Today's rules package is actually proof of Republican unity, and it is proof that we are committed to increased accountability, transparency, and fiscal responsibility for this chamber and for our country, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
The gentleman's taking credit for the 72-hour rule, which we created in our rules package, but thank you very much. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, the Democratic whip, Ms. Clark.
The gentlelady from Massachusetts is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the gentleman from Massachusetts for yielding. When Roe v. Wade was overturned, the impact on Americans was swift and devastating. Women were denied health care. Doctors were threatened with criminal charges. Hospitals were forced to put their liability over patients' lives. And as the GOP doubled down on its plan for a national abortion ban, the American people saw it for what it was: anti-woman, anti-choice, anti-family, and anti-freedom. Kansas, California, Kentucky, Michigan, Montana, Vermont, voters across the country rejected this extremism. And with this anti-freedom agenda exposed, some of my Republican colleagues started to scrub their websites, roll back their rhetoric, and dodge questions on abortion. But here we are again in this rules package. Within days of taking over the House majority, Republicans are pushing legislation to limit women's rights. So let's see where you truly stand. Today, House Democrats offer the Women's Health Protection Act to make abortion access a federal right, no matter your zip code or your income. Do my colleagues across the aisle believe that families, in consultation with their doctors, with their faith, with their life circumstances, should decide when to have children? Or do my colleagues think that is a decision for Republican politicians? Vote to make Roe v. Wade the law of the land. Vote for freedom. I yield back.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to my good friend, the distinguished gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to support the Republican rules package, return to common sense in the people's house. I want to point out a few line items in the rules package for particular praise. This bill returns a historical norm of in-person meetings and in-person votes. No more proxy voting or remote committee hearings. Let's do the work in the people's house. This bill returns a Holman rule. If there was ever a time for this House to stop paying the salaries of bad bureaucrats, it's now. Tony Fauci deserves that step. I think knowing this rule was coming is one of the reasons he's now mercifully left government service. The power to fire unelectable bureaucrats who abuse their power is central reason to support this package. In the past, the 3-day rule has been abused. Bills being dropped in the dead of night to be voted on 2 mornings later is just wrong. Moving to a true 72-hour rule will end that abusive practice. Eliminating the Gephardt rule to ensure that this House has true debate over whether or not to raise a debt limit is a move in the right direction for fiscal sanity in the people's house. And so is the 3/5 majority requirement to raise taxes. I want to thank my fellow Freedom Caucus members and my friends in the House leadership for making these necessary changes to the rules package. I ask my colleagues to pass this package. Now, since Chairman McGovern, or Ranking Member McGovern, mentioned the IRS bill coming up, let me just point out, we need to rescind that. 87,000 IRS agents, you know what that equates to? 200 new IRS agents in every congressional district in this country. That's 1,740 new IRS agents in every state for one purpose: to go after small businesses, hardworking Americans who try to raise money to pay for reckless spending. Reckless spending that's caused $31 trillion in debt in this nation. This is the right thing to do. I tell you what, we could repurpose those agents to the southern border, or we could repurpose them and let them build the Keystone XL pipeline. You know what? There was about estimated 61,000 lost jobs with the Keystone XL pipeline when Biden administration canceled that project. But yet we turn around and government hires 87,000 new IRS agents to go after your constituents and mine. I mentioned earlier the number. Look it up. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
I, my friend, that the first bill you're doing is going to add $114 billion to the deficit. Enough. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, the chairman of the Democratic Caucus, Mr. Aguilar.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. I rise today in opposition to the rules package, which was written behind closed doors. What we're voting on this evening is nothing short of complete surrender to the demands of the most extreme Republicans on the other side of the aisle. Rather than taking this opportunity to bring us together, the adoption of this rules package sets us on a path toward division and default. The extremists plan to use these rules to hold the economy hostage and to enact more cuts to Social Security and Medicare. Mr. Speaker, last week our nation saw the lowest unemployment in 50 years, a testament to the leadership of President Biden and House Democrats. And yet it's clear that the new majority is determined to undermine that economic recovery at every turn. I urge a no vote and yield back.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to my very good friend, the distinguished gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Kamick.
Gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of H-Res 5, adopting the rules for the 118th Congress. First, this rules package is an incredible win, not just for conservatives, but for all Americans. Americans deserve a House of Representatives that serves the people, not a political or personal agenda. For decades, we've heard a series of questions, things like, why can't we simply pass bills that address a single issue? Why do we have to Christmas tree these bills? Why isn't there enough time to read the bills? Heck, why don't members have to show up to work to get paid? I hear that all the time. And that, among other things, is what we have addressed in this rules package. And to be sure folks back home understand, this rules package is the document that dictates how we, as members, conduct business up here, and that is why it is so important to get this right. This is the most conservative and transparent rules package in recent history, and the thanks goes to the Republican conference at large for working on this and approving this and debating these proposals on 3 separate occasions since November. Here's a sampling of just what's in this common sense package. First, every single member of this body will have at least 72 hours to review each bill. Second, members will now be forced to vote in person rather than via proxy. Personally, I have never voted proxy, and for me it's pretty simple. If you collect a paycheck, you should show up. After nearly 3 years of abusing this historic voting change, we are finally putting an end to proxy voting. If my husband, as a first responder, along with thousands of other first responders across this country, showed up every single shift at the height of COVID without complaint, members of Congress should be able to do the same. Now, on November 29th, I testified before the Rules Committee that single-issue bills are one of the single most important things we can do to restore trust in this institution. I am proud to report that this package includes this new requirement, and that is that all members certify their bills introduced in the House address a single issue. A huge thanks goes to my friend and colleague from Virginia, Representative Morgan Griffith, for his work on this issue. Additionally, this rules package establishes a brand new select committee that will be tasked to investigate the weaponization of the federal government. No longer will the DOJ be allowed to target parents who show up for their kids. No longer will the FBI be able to collude with social media companies to censor Americans. Finally, in the ultimate move to drain the swamp, and one that I am particularly proud of, this rules package, it reinstates the Holman Rule, which allows members of this body to offer amendments to appropriations bills to reduce the salary or to fire certain employees or cut federal programs. These unelected bureaucrats, the true, real swamp creatures here in D.C., have run roughshod over the American people without consequence, and today marks our first, but certainly not our last, move to hold them accountable. This package is a product that brings transparency and trust to a broken process, and I want to thank all of my colleagues from the Republican Conference for their grit and grace in working to put this package together. I urge its passage, and I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, the gentlelady mentioned the 72-hour rule. Once again, I'll say you're welcome. And then she talked about this being the most open and transparent rule ever. Maybe the gentlelady can share with us the secret 3-page addendum that we're reading about, because none of us have seen it. So much for transparency. I guess she's not going to share that with us. But in any event, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Holmes Norton.
Gentlelady from the District of Columbia is recognized for 1 minute.
These rules are a gratuitous attack on already limited rights of D.C. residents. Our residents have all the obligations of citizenship, including paying all federal taxes, but are denied voting rights in Congress and full local self-government. To add insult to injury, these rules take away floor privilege of the D.C. mayor. The rules continue to grant governors and 16 other categories of people, including foreign ministers, floor privileges. Not only does D.C.'s mayor operate like state governors, including managing a jurisdiction that has both a budget and population larger than those of several states, but Congress has undemocratic plenary authority over D.C. and regularly uses its authority to legislate on local matters. While D.C. deserves statehood, if any non-member of Congress deserves the needs floor privileges, it is D.C.'s mayor. I yield back.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 4 minutes to my very good friend, distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank the Speaker, and I thank my friend from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole, and I'm delighted to be down here on the floor of the House of Representatives in a Republican majority, and I'm delighted to be talking about a rules package crafted by that Republican majority and that reflects what I think is a fundamental transformation of this House to ensure that the people can be represented by their representatives. That's the point. There's a reason that I've had great conversations with some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle about why having 72 hours to read a bill, or why having a bill that isn't littered with Christmas tree additional subjects rather than single subjects, as my friend from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, articulated so well, or whether having germane amendments and being able to open up the floor by virtue of changing the rules or restoring the Holman rules so we can have an impact on agencies that are out of control and not responding to the people's house. There's a reason why those rules are so fundamentally important. To restore this body, to restore the people's house. That's why we're here. Everybody keeps running around in classic swamp speak talking about secret deals, secret addendums. What we're talking about is how people come to an agreement in this town to ensure that we're going to carry out what we said we're going to do. The rules package is on full display. The rules package has been on full display and publicly available since Friday, to the best of my knowledge, or earlier last week. The text of that rules package has been something we could look at. And my friends are right. A good chunk of that text was the agreement reached a while back, a couple of weeks ago, a week or two ago, with one significant change. The single person motion to vacate, which is in the spirit of that which goes all the way back to Jefferson. In fact, we are currently now operating not under any rules. That's why we're having a debate. We're about to debate on adopting the rules. I could walk down right there into the well and file a motion to vacate, single person, right now. Because that's the precedent. That's what we're operating under. Because that goes back to Jefferson. The whole point here is trying to ensure that we're continuing the great history of the people's house. Yes, we have had conversations and agreements as individuals are supposed to do, looking each other in the eye and saying, we're going to bring balanced budgets to the floor of the House. You bet that we've got agreements that we're going to do that. You bet that we've had agreements that we're going to bring the Texas border plan to make sure we secure the border rather than perpetuating the fraud that the President of the United States continues to perpetuate, endangering the American people. You bet that we're bringing forward a promise to have legislation that will set term limits because the American people are tired of a House that doesn't represent them. You bet that we've got agreements to do those things. You bet that we've been talking about making sure that we can bring amendments to the floor of this House, open debate amendments on appropriations bills, that was a part of the package that we're talking about. And you bet that a part of our agreement was ensuring that a church-style committee under the leadership of my good friend, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, in the Judiciary Committee, to target the weaponization of government against the American people. You bet that those agreements were reached. I will not back away from that or shy away from it. But this rules package is a rules package that reflects this body, the entirety of the Republican Party, on making sure that we restore the people's house. And we are united to do that. We are coming out of last week strong, united to make sure that we stand up for the American people, and I encourage everybody to vote for this rules package, and I yield back.
Members are advised and reminded not to engage in personalities toward the president. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, and I want to thank the gentleman again for mentioning the 72-hour rule, which has been mentioned many times, but I wrote it, and I want to thank you for keeping it. But when I hear people talk about balanced budgets, give me a break. The first bill that you are bringing to the floor, according to CBO, adds $114 billion to the debt. So we don't need any lectures from anybody on that side about balancing the budget. Give me a break. And I would like to, maybe the gentleman could, again, share with us the secret addendum that apparently was negotiated behind closed doors, so we actually know what agreements were made. I mean, 4 days and 15 votes, and there's only one change in the rules package, going from 5 to be able to vacate the chair to 1. Well, there's a lot more to it. We all know that, but that's a big secret. So much for transparency. At this point, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
The so-called rules package proposed by House Republicans would perpetuate the same disorder, division, and dysfunction that nearly devoured the Republican nominee for Speaker. A single-member threshold for filing a motion to vacate empowers extremism and rewards rabble-rousing. It would make the House so dysfunctional as to be ungovernable. It would give the new Speaker only a Pyrrhic victory because a motion to vacate makes him arbitrarily removable at any moment at the whim of any person, no matter how personal or petty the underlying grievance. Simply put, this is no way to govern. Moreover, House Republicans decry the weaponization of the federal government. Yet the Holman Rule would enable the federal government to be weaponized against any federal official who draws the wrath of the Republican majority. The Holman Rule would enable House Republicans to zero out funding for a criminal investigation into Donald Trump. The new rules would defund the Office of Congressional Ethics. The new rules would enable a member being investigated by the FBI to investigate the investigators investigating him. Mr. Speaker, so much for draining the swamp. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 90 seconds to my good friend, the distinguished member from Georgia, Mr. Clyde.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding. Last week, I was part of the 20 conservative members who fought for significant institutional change in order to restore the people's voice in the people's house. Of the many victories we secured for the American people, the Thomas Jefferson motion to vacate the chair is the most important to me, as it holds the Speaker accountable to the people. This Jeffersonian motion stood strong for more than 200 years before then Speaker Pelosi removed it in 2018, consolidating power in the hands of a select few in leadership. By restoring this historic rule, every solitary member has the authority to hold the Speaker accountable for following all of the rules, including passing single-subject bills, allowing members at least 72 hours to read the legislation before voting on it, and reinstating the Holman Rule, which allows amendments to decrease funding for certain government programs, all the way down to the individual job description. I thank my Republican colleagues and Speaker McCarthy for working in good faith to produce and pass a rules package that ensures this body is working for the people and not for itself. And I encourage every member to vote for it. Fixing a broken Washington, D.C. is a major win for every citizen. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
I'm happy to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is
thank the
recognized
gentleman.
for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I rise in strong opposition to this legislation. It's the so-called rules package. I can't wait for that term limits vote here. When you ask members on the Republican side who have been here for 20 or 30 years, then to codify their votes and say that you can only be here for 12, try explaining that one back home when you've got a 4-seat majority. This is an extreme proposal that's in front of us. It will eventually, if they follow the logic to its manifestation, this will pit Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid against defense spending. Our seniors will be sold out, our military will be sold out, and the full faith and credit of the United States will be under threat, all in the quest to organize the House. The gentleman from South Dakota, nice enough fellow, he said people are making a lot about the chaos that ensued here over 4 days, and particularly last Saturday morning. Was the gentleman denying that he was here for the country to witness what happened here? This is part of a rules package that is being foisted upon the American people by a small minority within the Republican Party, and we ought to turn it down.
Gentleman from Oklahoma, with 3½ minutes remaining.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to my good friend, distinguished gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Congressman Cole. It is a new day in Congress. Mr. McGovern, you mentioned the 72-hour rule was put in by you and the Democrats. Why didn't you enforce it? You didn't. We were forced to vote on votes like the omnibus that were 4,155 pages long. The American people are tired of it. Last week was a great week. You saw democracy at its best. And guess what? We were off 24 weeks during the last session. We can take however many days it is to debate something that the American people should see. The great part about this rules package, it restores financial sanity. And that's why I'm so proud to support, along with Speaker McCarthy, this new rules package that implements fiscal and budgetary restraints on Congress. It includes provisions included are huge wins for the American people, for everybody to see. We were given assurance that this package will do the job, and we could not continue the downward trajectory that your party has put on American people over the last 2 years and last 4 years. Now's the time that we deal with what is a growing insanity, and I'm just thankful that they're here. I yield back.
Members are advised to direct their comments to the chair. Gentleman from Massachusetts, with 13½ minutes remaining.
I would just say to the gentleman that in the vast majority of cases, we did comply with the 72-hour rule. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford.
Gentleman from Nevada is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the chair for yielding. This Republican rules package is more like rules wreckage, and it has very little to do with governance. Adding insult to the American people, Speaker McCarthy and MAGA Republicans want to defund the IRS so that their millionaire and billionaire friends don't have to pay their fair share in taxes, while hardworking people in Nevada's 4th District pick up the tab. There's a persistent problem with the wealthiest Americans evading taxes or hiding their money in secret offshore bank accounts in order to avoid paying their tax obligations. In fact, according to a new Syracuse University analysis, low-income wage earners were audited 5.5 times more than the people in every other tax bracket in 2022. Democrats put people over politics and provided the resources and funding that the IRS needs to go after the super rich tax cheats. It is not fair that taxpayers with lower incomes are more likely to be audited than high-income taxpayers. And adding additional insult, their first bill adds more than $100 billion to the deficit over the next 10 years. What does that say about reducing our deficit? Stop this hypocritical.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
I ask for my time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the Speaker be authorized to postpone the vote on ordering the previous question on House Resolution 5 to a designated time later today.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the Chair may reduce to 5 minutes the minimum time for electronic voting on any question relating to House Resolution 5 that follows a 15-minute vote.
Without objection.
With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, following the vote on the previous question, Representative DeLauro will offer a motion to commit. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Connecticut to discuss that proposal.
Gentlelady from Connecticut is recognized for 1 minute.
When we conclude this rules debate, I will offer a motion to commit to add the expanded child tax credit. In the face of the Republican majority's draconian agenda, we want to provide a tax cut, yes, to children and to families to make ends meet. The child tax credit is the most effective tool we have in the fight against rising costs, an antidote to inflation. It is about financial stability for families. Nothing in this rules package helps American families. Make no mistake, A vote against the motion to commit means Republicans are willing to raise taxes on working families. The expanded child tax credit was the largest tax cut for working families in generations, a lifeline to the middle class. It drove the largest decrease in child poverty in history. People could pay their electric bills, fill their gas tanks, pay for child care. It reached more than 61 million children, lifted 4 million out of poverty, led to a 26% decline in hunger in families with children. There has never been a federal program that has such a profound impact in such a short amount of time. Do the right thing. Vote yes on the motion to commit. I yield back.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I reserve my time.
He reserves his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Del Bene.
Gentlelady from Washington is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Later this evening, my colleague and friend, Congresswoman DeLauro, will offer a motion to add the expanded child tax credit to the rules package. This gives us an opportunity to start the 118th Congress on the right foot. Instead of focusing on an extremist agenda, we can advance a proven solution to an issue that impacts every community in our country: childhood poverty. The U.S. shamefully has one of the highest rates of childhood poverty in the developed world. We have a solution that we know works: the expanded child tax credit that delivered up to $300 per child each month to over 40 million families. These resources help parents pay for food, rent, gas, and other essentials. We must bring back the expanded child tax credit and deliver for children and families. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this motion to commit. Reducing childhood poverty should be a bipartisan effort. I yield back.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I continue to reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, again, let me just ask, will anybody on the other side just share with us the secret 3-page addendum that Speaker McCarthy negotiated with the Freedom Caucus so we can know what else was decided on, given away? I guess not. I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Barragan.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise in opposition to the rule. The rules package is anti-Latino. It makes and order bills that attack abortion rights and reproductive health that Latinas rely on. It doubles down on Republicans' inhumane treatment of Latino migrants fleeing violence and persecution. And later today, Republicans plan to rush a vote on a bill that protects wealthy and ultra-wealthy tax cheats, leaving low-income Black and Latino communities to bear the brunt of tax audits because they make easy targets. Republicans have begun this Congress with chaos and now plan to push extreme policies that do nothing to help Latinos in this country. I urge my colleagues to vote against this rule. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to my good friend, the distinguished gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill.
Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized for 1 minute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend from Oklahoma, and certainly my colleague from Massachusetts knows my deep affection for him. But since I've walked in the House floor tonight, I keep hearing this reference to this rules package, that somehow it's not posted on our website, and we're debating something else called an addendum to the rules package. So I just wanted to come to the House floor as someone who worked quite passionately last week with, on the behalf of our new Speaker, working on an agreement with all my colleagues so that we are unified in the House Republican Conference, that there is no addendum to this package, Mr. Speaker. There's no 3-page addendum. There's no extra stuff. Everything in the House rules package is posted on the House website. We made one addition as a conference, and that was the change in the vacate the chair motion. So, Mr. Speaker, I just want to be clear in the congressional record and on those watching on C-SPAN and my colleagues, there's not a 3-page addendum to the rules package. I greatly respect my good friend from Massachusetts, my friend from Oklahoma, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
So, Mr. Speaker, I have great respect for my friend, but really, I mean, come on. What were the last 4 days about? Again, days and days and 15 roll call votes and reporting by multiple sources tell us that there is this side agreement with the House Freedom Caucus that deals with some of the most controversial concessions. I know it exists, It'll come out sooner or later, but I think, everybody's talking about transparency and openness. It would be nice if there was a little bit more transparency and openness from the other side. At that, Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
I thank the gentleman. Thank the Speaker. I rise in opposition to the rules and the rules package. In particular, I support the Women's Health Protection Act, so women seeking reproductive rights will not be hunted down by bounty hunters. And as well, I am opposed to this rule because of the creation of a potential committee that in fact threatens our safety, security, and freedom. It is an unprecedented attack on our nation's law enforcement agencies, our justice system, and our intelligence community, all for the extreme MAGA Republican political activities. This does nothing to solve the actual problems facing the American people, and even includes a possibility of defunding police. Finally, I am glad that the last government, the last Congress, indicated that when 1 million Americans died, for continuity of government, we had proxy voting. They wanted to save lives. I oppose the underlying rules and the rules package. I ask my colleagues to join me in voting no. I yield back.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I reserve my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
So, Mr. Speaker, let me again continue what I was beginning in the last exchange. It's at least one GOP office apparently has the much fabled 3-page House Rules Addendum. Quote, "We're taking a look at it. We're just going through it," end quote, says Rep. Ken Calvert, a steering committee member, tells Axios. Asked if members have received a copy, quote, "I don't know if everybody has," end quote. So, again, don't come to the floor and talk about transparency and openness and a new day. This is backroom politics. That's what this is about. Secret deals that no one's going to know anything about until it's too late. I reserve my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 2 minutes.
Who laments that the 2 minutes are no longer magic. Mr. Speaker, these rules are largely the rules that we've had for some period of time over the years. But they have important changes. Unfortunately, I view those changes as not facilitating our work, but seeking to impede our work. I think that's unfortunate. They're also designed to target federal employees if members of Congress don't like what they do. There, of course, is a process to do that, but as the leader on the other side did at one point in time, he just cut out the salary for an employee he didn't like or thought was acting improperly. That was not appropriate, and of course that did not prevail. But I regret that we don't have an opportunity to look at these rules in the way that so many on this floor talked about doing. First of all, of course, they're not single issues. There are a lot of issues. It's the rules. Secondly, there are ways and means to provide for consideration in a transparent, open fashion in which I could offer an amendment to a rule that I thought was not in the benefit of this House or the American people. Unfortunately, the process, which is the very first process under which we have considered a piece of business, not necessarily legislation, and that is ironic. But it is what it is. But it will, as such a process does, force us to vote against a piece of organizational rules because we don't agree with some of those rules. And that's what I will do. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, can I inquire of the gentleman from Oklahoma how many more speakers he has?
Prepared to close whenever my friend is.
I think. I think I'm prepared to close as well. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the remaining time.
Gentleman is recognized for his remaining time, which is 5½ minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the last time House Republicans were in charge, they ended their time in power with a government shutdown. They controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House, and they shut the government down and walked away. Upon taking power once again, they began with a legislative shutdown, a shutdown where a far-right fringe held the incoming Republican leadership hostage and got them to give away everything, including their own dignity. What's clear from all of this is that the Republican Party no longer cares about governing. And this rule package is exhibit number 1. The American people sent us here because they want us to put people over politics. Sadly, this rule package puts politics first, empowering the extremists who are only interested in their own power. As I've said again and again, if this new majority wants to work together in good faith, my door is open. But if this is their plan, they've clearly chosen to become a party that embraces election deniers and extremists. And Democrats will not go along to get along. You know, finally, Mr. Speaker, let me say that I've had some harsh words for this rules package. Call it tough love. I care very deeply about this institution, about the work that we do here, and the awesome responsibility of decisions we make. And I'm glad that my friends kept the McGovern rule on the 72-hour, and the McGovern rule that committees have to do hearings and markups before they come to the Rules Committee. We weren't perfect, but overwhelmingly we kept our word. This legislation does a great disservice to the people we represent, and it does not live up to the high standards that we should have for this institution. I believe that calling this House to a higher standard is the right thing to do. But let me be clear that my criticism is reserved for the resolution we are considering and not for the distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma, whom I respect and admire as a person, even when we strongly disagree, as we do today. These rules are a giveaway to the far right, but this Congress need not be. If my Republican colleagues want to get anything done, it is clear that they're going to have to work together with Democrats to get things done. Let's end the extremism and put people over politics to get stuff done. People do not want government shutdowns. People do not want to see us default on our financial obligations. People want us to get stuff done and to keep the lights on. The last two elections were a rejection of extremism. My friends predicted an overwhelming Republican majority in the last election, and instead they got a pink splash because the American people, Democrats, independents, and a lot of Republicans said, you are too extreme. So put the extremism behind you. I urge the Speaker to work with Democrats and not just work with a small fringe group in the Republican conference, but to work in a way to move the people's agenda forward. I urge a no vote on this resolution, a no on the previous question, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Oklahoma with 90 seconds to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself the balance of my time. In closing, I want to urge all my colleagues to support this resolution establishing the rules of the 118th Congress. The changes we're proposing today will ensure that the institution is set on a path for success in the new Congress. They will ensure that members return to Washington and do their work here. They will set up an institution to hold the Biden administration accountable, and they will put in place budgetary rules designed to prevent the kind of reckless spending spree Democrats recently engaged in. I urge all members to vote yes on the previous question and yes on the rule. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time and move the previous question on the resolution.
Question is on ordering the previous question on the resolution. All those in favor will say aye. Anyone opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Previous question is a gentleman from Massachusetts.
Speaker, I ask for the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to the order of the House of today, further proceedings on this question are postponed. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House stand in recess until approximately 6:30 p.m.
Without objection, the House stands in recess. The House will be in order. Proceedings will resume on questions previously postponed. Votes will be taken in the following order. Ordering the previous question on House Resolution 5. Motion to commit House Resolution 5 if offered, and adoption of House Resolution 5 if offered. The first electronic vote will be conducted as a 15-minute vote. Pursuant to the order of the House today, remaining electronic votes will be conducted as 5-minute votes. Pursuant to the order of the House of today, the unfinished business is the vote on ordering the previous question on House Resolution 5, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 5, resolution adopting the rules of the House of Representatives for the 118th Congress and for other purposes.
The question is on ordering the previous question on the resolution. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 211, the nays are 205. The previous question is ordered. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Connecticut seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have a motion to commit at the desk.
The clerk will report the motion.
Ms. DeLauro of Connecticut moves to commit the resolution, House Resolution 5, to a select committee composed of the majority leader or the minority leader, with instructions to report the same back to the House forthwith with the following amendment. At the end of the resolution,
Mr. Speaker,
Clerk will suspend. Gentlelady from Connecticut.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading.
Without objection, the motion is considered as read. Without objection, the previous question is ordered on the motion to commit. The question is on the motion. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The noes have it. The motion is not agreed to. Gentlelady from Connecticut.
Ask for the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of the vote by the yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to the order of the House of today, this is a five-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 210, the nays are 220. The motion is not adopted. The question is on adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Resolution is agreed to. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
On that, I ask for a recorded vote.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring by taking a vote by the... Say again? Does the gentleman ask for the yeas and nays?
That doesn't count.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays are ordered. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device, again pursuant to the order of the House of today. This is a 5-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 220, the nays are 213. The resolution is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The House will be in order. Members, you can take your conversations from the floor. Clear the aisle, clear the well. The House has business to conduct. The House will be in order. Members, clear the aisles. Take a seat or your conversations from the floor. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I offer a privileged resolution and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Resolution 6. Resolved that unless otherwise recorded, the hour of daily meeting of the House shall be 2 p.m. on Mondays, noon on Tuesdays, or 2 p.m. if no legislative business was conducted on the preceding Monday, noon on Wednesdays and Thursdays, and 9 a.m. on all other days of the week.
Without objection, the resolution is agreed to. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole, seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I offer a privileged concurrent resolution and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the concurrent resolution.
House Concurrent Resolution 1. Resolved by the House of Representatives that the Senate concurring that pursuant to Clause 4 and Section 5 of Article 1 of the Constitution, during the 118th Congress, the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader of the Senate, or their respective designees, acting jointly after consultation with the Minority Leader of the House and the Minority Leader of the Senate, may notify the members of the House and the Senate, respectively, to assemble at a place outside the District of Columbia if, in their opinion, the public interest shall warrant it.
Without objection, the concurrent resolution is agreed to, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana, the Majority Leader, Mr. Scalise, seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that during the 118th Congress, the Speaker, Majority Leader, and Minority Leader be authorized to accept resignations and to make appointments authorized by law or by the House.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker,
Gentleman from Louisiana.
I also ask unanimous consent that during the 118th Congress, all members be permitted to extend their remarks and to include extraneous material within the permitted limit in that section of the record entitled Extensions of Remarks.
Without objection. Gentleman from Louisiana.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that during the first session of the 118th Congress, on legislative days of Monday or Tuesday when the House convenes pursuant to House Resolution 6, the House shall convene 2 hours earlier than the time otherwise established by the resolution for the purpose of conducting morning hour debate. On legislative days of Wednesday or Thursday when the House convenes pursuant to House Resolution 6, the House shall convene 2 hours earlier than the time otherwise established by the resolution for the purpose of conducting morning hour debate. When the House convenes pursuant to an order other than House Resolution 6, the House shall convene for the purpose of conducting morning hour debate only as prescribed by such order. The time for morning hour debate shall be allocated equally between the parties and may not continue beyond 10 minutes before the hour appointed for the resumption of the session of the House. And the form of proceeding for morning hour debate shall be as follows. The prayer by the chaplain, the approval of the journal, and the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag shall be postponed until resumption of the session of the House. Initial and subsequent recognitions for debate shall alternate between the parties. Recognitions shall be conferred by the Speaker only pursuant to lists submitted by the Majority Leader and by the Minority Leader. No member may address the House for longer than 5 minutes except the Majority Leader, the Minority Leader, or the Minority Whip. No legislative business shall be in order except the filing of privileged reports, and following morning hour debate, the chair shall declare a recess pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1 until the time appointed for the resumption of the session of the House. And the Speaker may dispense with morning hour debate upon receipt of notification described in Clause 12C of Rule 1 or upon a change in reconvening pursuant to Clause 12E of Rule 1 and notify members accordingly.
Without objection.
That I
The
yield back.
chair announces the Speaker's appointment pursuant to 2 U.S. Code 2001 in the order of the House of today, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, as members of the House Office Building Commission to serve with the Speaker. The chair announces that the Speaker has delivered to the clerk a letter dated January 7th, 2023, listing members in the order in which shall act as Speaker pro tem under Clause 8B3 of Rule 1. The chair lays before the House a communication.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., January 7, 2023. I hereby designate Representative Steve Scalise of Louisiana to exercise any authority regarding assembly, reassembly, convening, or reconvening of the House pursuant to House Concurrent Resolution 1, Clause 12 of Rule 1, and any concurrent resolution of the current Congress as may contemplate my designation of members to exercise similar authority. In the event of the death or inability of that designee, the alternate members of the House listed in the letter bearing this date that I have placed with the clerk are designated in turn for the same purposes. Signed sincerely, Kevin McCarthy, Speaker.
The chair lays before the House a communication.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., January 7, 2023. I hereby appoint the Honorable Patrick McHenry, the Honorable Adrian Smith, the Honorable Robert Whitman, the Honorable Andy Harris, the Honorable Richard Hudson, the Honorable John Joyce, and the Honorable Guy Reschenthaler to act as Speaker pro tempore to sign enrolled bills and joint resolutions through the remainder of the 118th Congress. Signed sincerely, Kevin McCarthy, Speaker.
The chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable, the Speaker, House of Representatives, Sir. Under Clause 2G of Rule 2 of the Rules of the U.S. House of Representatives, I herewith designate Ms. Lisa P. Grant, Deputy Clerk, Mr. Kevin F. McCumber, Deputy Clerk, Ms. Tanya Sloan, Legal Counsel, and Ms. Cheryl H. Muller, Director of Personnel, to sign any and all papers and perform all other acts for me under the name of the Clerk of the House for which they would be authorized to do by virtue of this designation, except such as are provided by statute in case of my temporary absence or disability. This designation shall remain in effect for the 118th Congress or until modified by me. Signed sincerely, Cheryl L. Johnson, Clerk of the House.
The chair lays before the House an additional communication.
The Honorable, the Speaker, House of Representatives, Sir, pursuant to the permission granted in Clause 2H of Rule 2 of the Rules of the House of Representatives, the clerk received the following message from the Secretary of the Senate on January 3, 2023 at 5:39 p.m. That the Senate agreed to informing the House of Representatives that a quorum of the Senate is assembled. Senate Resolution 2. That the Senate agreed to notifying the House of Representatives of the election of a President pro tempore. Senate Resolution 5. Signed sincerely, Cheryl L. Johnson, Clerk.
The chair customarily takes this occasion at the outset of a Congress to announce policies with respect to particular aspects of the legislative process. The chair will insert in the record announcements concerning, first, privileges of the floor; second, introduction of bills and resolutions; third, unanimous consent requests for consideration of legislation; fourth, recognition for 1-minute speeches; fifth, recognition for special order speeches; sixth, decorum in debate; seventh, conduct of votes by electronic device; eighth, use of handouts on the House floor; ninth, use of electronic equipment on the House floor; and 10th, use of the chamber. These announcements, where appropriate, will reiterate the origins of the stated policies. The chair intends to continue in the 118th Congress the policies reflected in these statements. The policy announced in the 102nd Congress with respect to jurisdictional concepts related to Clauses 5A of Rule 21, tax and tariff measures, will continue to govern but need to be reiterated as it is adequately documented as precedent in the House Rules and Manual. Without objection, The announcements will be printed in the record.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith, seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 5, I call up the bill H.R. 23, the Family and Small Business Taxpayer Protection Act, and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 23, a bill to rescind certain balances made available to the Internal Revenue Service.
Gentleman will suspend. Pursuant to House Resolution 5, the bill is considered read. The bill shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the majority leader and the minority leader, or their respective designees. The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith, and the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal, will each control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill currently under consideration.
Without objection.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the process for considering our first bill of the 118th Congress reflects our commitment to Americans and an open legislative process. Congresswoman Michelle Steele and I first introduced this bill in September. Members were given more than 72 hours notice prior to today's consideration. 72 hours is more than enough time for members to review this bill. In fact, it's 2 pages long and covers only one topic. If members wish to vote on this bill, they must be present in the House chamber because proxy voting is no longer an option. Now let's focus on what this bill does. It repeals the vast majority of the Internal Revenue Service funding Democrats enacted last year in order to pay for their Green New Deal. The primary purpose of that funding is hiring more auditors and support staff to vastly expand IRS's audit capacity. And not just audits on wealthy Americans. With that expanded capacity, IRS can bring in more revenue by auditing more middle and lower income families and more small businesses. Families and small businesses are struggling under the weight of record inflation and supply chain shortages. Small businesses are struggling to find workers at any wage. The overwhelming majority of Americans, about 85%, follow the law and pay their taxes. The last thing they need is more IRS agents knocking on doors to conduct audits. Yet this IRS funding is part of the broad Biden administration strategy to tax and audit exponentially more Americans by looking into their bank accounts, requiring online payment services to report them when they split a dinner check with friends or pay their babysitter after a night out, and then target them using 87,000 new IRS employees. Americans deserve to know their government is working for them, not against them. Today, Mr. Speaker, you are going to hear Democrats claim there really won't be 87,000 new IRS employees.
In order, please take your conversations elsewhere. The gentleman may resume.
I imagine they'll say that new employees aren't going to target middle-class families and small businesses and that Republicans don't care about IRS's customer service failings. Let's focus on the facts. When a federal agency hires a new employee to replace one who retires, it does not increase the agency's headcount. Yet the Biden administration's own documents say they are increasing headcount by 87,000 over the next decade with these funds. Secretary Yellen's own instructions to IRS stated audit rates of families earning less than $400,000 should continue to be audited at historically similar rates. Under those instructions, 9 out of every 10 new audits can target families earning less than $400,000. And because Republicans are committed to delivering a government that is accountable, this bill retains funding for customer service and IT modernization at IRS, despite the fact these accounts would be more appropriately addressed through regular appropriations to ensure IRS has the resources to make much-needed improvement to taxpayer services. Mr. Speaker, there are numerous reasons to support this bill. It protects families and small businesses. It ensures agencies are funded appropriately. Most importantly, it stops autopilot funding for an out-of-control government agency that is perhaps most in need of reform. IRS needs to fix its customer service and return processing problems, not focus on auditing families and small businesses. Americans want an IRS that works for them, not against them. This bill is a great first step in that direction, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I might consume.
So ordered.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 23, and my friend from Nebraska, he suggested a number of issues that we intend to challenge during the course of the next half hour based upon the facts. So this is theater tonight, Mr. Speaker. If we didn't get enough of the entertainment factor last week, we're going to proceed with it again this evening. 87,000 IRS agents. Let me debunk that right away. There are regular retirements of up to 8,000 a year. We're replacing them. How about the methodology of a computer upgrade, an investment in technology, more modeling? Or should we have an IRS that operates the way Southwest Airlines did last week, to the dismay of the American family? This is a messaging bill, Mr. Speaker, and the message that they choose to send, and let everybody understand this, the first bill that they have submitted, according to the Congressional Budget Office, adds $114 billion to the federal deficit. Legislation number one. They don't want a fairer tax administration. They think it's bad for some of their supporters. But you know what? What they're attempting to do tonight is bad for middle-class families. It's bad for small businesses, who then are asked to pay more when the people at the top don't pay their fair share. I have a letter that I wish to submit that came from Charles Rosati, the former IRS commissioner, and he points out in the opening paragraph of a tax notes special, and by the way, those of us in the tax world, we know what tax notes means. He said that last year, and this would be 2021, the federal government failed to collect $574 billion of taxes that were legally due but not paid. That's equal more to most of the federal deficit. They want to reduce the deficit? We should do a better job with tax compliance, which, after all, is the basis of a representative democracy. 86% of the American people, Mr. Speaker, they pay their taxes every year on time. Do you know why? Because they get paid in wages and it comes from withholding taxes. That's what it's about. The American people are wise to what's being presented here tonight. We live in a two-tier tax system. Wage earners follow the rules. Wealthy billionaires, they get to skirt their responsibilities, and that's what we're being asked to vote on tonight. IRS funding has been stagnant. Staffing levels have dropped. Have you tried getting an IRS office on the phone? How many times will we continue to let those at the top get away without paying their share? We lose out, just think of it again, almost $600 billion a year in unpaid taxes. It's very sophisticated tax planning that is done by high-priced attorneys and CPAs. It's estimated that this could be up to $7 trillion because we score items over the course of 10 years. So what might this funding pay for? How about Social Security? How about Medicare? How about a strong military? How about a child tax credit that could be expanded? How about universal paid family and medical leave? And how about bringing down health care costs? The audit rates amongst millionaires has declined by 70% since 2010. Let me repeat that for anybody who didn't get that. The audit rate for millionaires has declined by 70% since 2010. Low-income workers who receive the earned income tax credit, they are audited now more than taxpayers who are making over $1 million a year. All we're asking for is fairness in the distribution of the responsibilities as to how we pay for government. There's a different set of standards across the land now, and to point out to you that once again, what is our commitment to America? It should be based on a fair tax system that collects what is due from those who ought to be paying. The former IRS commissioner, a Republican, Charles Reddick, he pointed out that he was fully in support of the legislation that we were offering because the IRS is continually outmaneuvered and outgunned by sophisticated efforts from tax lawyers and CPAs. We have to put American families over the politics and the distribution of theater that we're witnessing tonight. see through this legislation and vote no. I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
The request will be granted without objection. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Nebraska.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent to submit an excerpt from the 2021 Biden administration proposal called the American Families Plan Tax Compliance Agenda that asks for $80 billion in IRS funding and clearly shows a plan for 86,852 new hires.
Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Carolina, a member of the Ways and Means Committee, Dr. Murphy.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today, and I thank the gentleman from Nebraska. I rise today in support of the Family Small Business Taxpayer Protection Act, one of the first legislative acts of the new Republican majority. Main Street America has suffered 2 years too many of Democrat one-party rule. Inflation continues to hover at record highs, and small businesses continue to struggle. The last thing that these small businesses can afford right now is 87,000 new IRS agents not only targeting their enterprises, but targeting their livelihoods. With 11 million tax returns still awaiting IRS action, the IRS should be focusing on doing their job rather than weaponizing their agency. This isn't new. The Democrats have used IRS and the tax code as a weapon before and are attempting to do it again. The Family and Small Business Taxpayer Protection Act rescinds new IRS funding intended to target middle-class families. This cannot wait. I urge passage of this bill so our small businesses can thrive, absent any fear of IRS agents knocking at their door. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett, who intends to talk about the tax gap.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
This first Republican bill should be known as the Protect Donald Trump and His Tax Cheating Cronies Act. After years of obstructing access to Donald Trump's tax returns, we learned how little he paid toward the cost of our national security and how poorly the Trump Internal Revenue Service enforced our tax laws. Each year, the richest 1% in our country avoid paying an incredible $160 billion of the taxes they owe. This crime wave of Trump-style tax cheating is made possible by Republican insistence on defunding the revenue police. Over the past decade, audit rates for corporations are down by half, the ultra-rich by 3/4. Republican claimed interest in law and order seems to vanish when it comes to tax fraud by the wealthiest few. And their very first bill adds $114 billion to our deficit. Yes, Trump may have been indispensable last week, but this is outrageous. When those like Trump don't pay what they owe, the tax burden gets shifted to small businesses and to families across our country. Reject the Republican drive to defund. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Nebraska.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent to submit for the record a Republican Ways and Means Committee release that explains the Congressional Budget Office's determination that it expects over $20 billion in revenue to come from the increased audits on taxpayers. That means families and small businesses making less than $400,000.
Without objection.
And Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Van Dyne.
The gentlelady from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in full support of H.R. 23, which rescinds the additional funding for the already inflated IRS. I think we can all agree that the last thing Americans need right now is a government who is actively working against them. One of the most outrageous provisions in the Democrats' so-called Inflation Reduction Act was giving the IRS $72 billion taxpayer dollars to hire 87,000 additional agents, whose job would be to stalk transactions of everyday Americans and attack small businesses. Middle-class Americans and the small businesses that fuel our economy have been unable to catch a break over the last 2 years. That ends today. There's simply no reasonable rationale to make the IRS larger than the Pentagon, State Department, FBI, and Border Control together. If we're adding an additional 87,000 agents, Why don't we send them to the southern border to help our border agents who are already overwhelmed and understaffed? I stand with my colleagues today in support of H.R. 23 to block the intrusive and unnecessary 87,000 new IRS agents. Americans deserve a government that will work for them, and stopping this funding is a first step in the right direction. I yield back.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from
Thank you, Mr.
Massachusetts.
Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the statement of the administration's policy opposing H.R. 23.
Without objection.
A CBO score for this bill showing that it will add $114 billion to the federal deficit over the next 10 years.
Without objection.
Thank you. An op-ed piece from the former IRS Commissioner Charles Rettig, a Republican, entitled, "IRS Sets the Record Straight. We're going after tax evaders, not honest Americans." Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, a much-valued member of the Ways and Means Committee, Congressman Thompson.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this misguided, expensive, and unpaid-for legislation. For years, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have done everything they can to demonize the IRS. But here's the reality. When the IRS doesn't have the funding it needs, two very bad things happen. The very wealthy tax cheats are able to avoid paying their fair share, and two, our constituents who need help from the IRS face unnecessary and disruptive delays in getting that help. You can't criticize the IRS for its performance while simultaneously fighting to cut the IRS budget. And despite what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would lead you to believe, there aren't 87,000 stormtroopers funded in this bill that are going to bang down your door. That is pure and utter nonsense. Taxes are the price we pay to live in a civilized society. They're a fundamental part of our civic responsibility to one another. This bill is a bad idea, and I encourage all my colleagues to vote no. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Nebraska.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes.
Gentleman from Kansas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased today to rise in support of common sense legislation that puts the American people ahead of padding the coffers of the IRS. It wasn't long ago that Washington was under one-party rule. This chamber was recently under the leadership of the Democrat Party that worked to give D.C. bureaucrats more power and wanted to hire an army of IRS agents to harass and audit my constituents while ignoring the need for more border agents to address the crisis at our southern border. Congressman Smith's legislation eliminates the devastating IRS provision that Democrats snuck into their so-called Inflation Reduction Act by rescinding the funding to this D.C. agency. The facts are that middle and lower income people are audited more by IRS agents by design of the IRS. The Kansans I represent need relief from high gas prices and rampant inflation caused by the current administration and one-party rule. My constituents don't need a supercharged IRS that will investigate their transaction between friends and sick 87,000 new agents on them. The bill, as the first bill that the new Congress addresses, puts our priorities on full display. Republicans are ready to restore our nation and hold our government accountable. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman from Kansas, my friend. He just pointed out that the people at the bottom are audited more than the people at the top. That's precisely the point that we're attempting to make here during the course of the next few minutes. So with that, let me recognize the distinguished gentleman from Maryland, the former Majority Leader, Mr. Hoyer, for 1 minute.
The gentleman from Maryland.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and adopt all the remarks he made in his opening statement. This debate about IRS lends itself to being the most dishonest, demagogic rhetoric that I see in the Congress at any point in time. I rise as the former chairman of the Treasury Postal Committee, now the Financial Services and General Government Committee, to which I will return, having left the Majority Leader's spot. This bill is a bad bill. Every small American taxpayer ought to be for this bill, because this bill will make sure that others pay their fair share as they do. That's the issue. They're paying their fair share, as the chairman noted, because we take it out of their salary. But the people who get it through dividends and capital gains, et cetera, they've got the lawyers, the accountants, and the people who can tell them how not to pay their fair share. This is a bill against small business. This is a bill against
Gentleman's
the small
time has
taxpayer.
expired.
This is against paying your fair share.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Nebraska.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent to submit for the record a Republican Ways and Means Committee release explaining that Senate Democrats voted down an amendment that would prevent increased audits on taxpayers making less than $400,000 a year, and House Democrats refused to take up a bill that would do the same.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith.
Gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman from Nebraska. House Republicans made a promise to the American people to fight for working class families. And we made a promise that our first order of business under a new Republican majority would be repeal the $80 billion Democrats gave the IRS to hire 87,000 new agents to target American working class families. We are delivering on that promise today. This bill rescinds the IRS funds in the Inflation Reduction Act, a law that does nothing to combat inflation, but everything to empower an agency that has targeted Americans. They've leaked taxpayer information, and under the Biden administration, they threaten to snoop into the bank accounts of millions of middle-class families. We know this because President Biden wrote such a proposal into his first budget as part of his agenda to expand the power of the IRS and shovel billions more to this troubled agency. At that time, we asked the Joint Committee on Taxation how many Americans might be subject to such a scheme to spy into the bank accounts. The JCT said up to 134 million taxpayers could be targeted. So much for just going after the millionaires and the billionaires that our Democrat colleagues like to talk about. And while the Biden administration, including Treasury Secretary Yellen, has tried to dismiss concerns over how middle-class Americans would be targeted by the IRS under the Democrats' $80 billion infusion of cash, the Congressional Budget Office has affirmed that undoubtedly families making less than $400,000 per year would be subjected to increased enforcement and, yes, audits by the IRS. But of course, this would be the case when you realize that more than half of the $80 billion Democrats gave the IRS is earmarked for enforcement. The IRS does not need a raise. It needs a reckoning. And what starts today with rescinding this $80 billion continues through rigorous IRS oversight that Democrats ignored under the one-party rule. Taxpayers deserve true oversight for an agency that leaked the tax returns of thousands of American taxpayers at the same time the White House was calling for tax increases on those individuals. We are talking about an agency with a history of targeting conservatives, with woefully underperforming customer service, and whose own commissioner under Obama called this $80 billion more than 3 times the amount of money the agency actually needed. House Republicans are ready to provide oversight and accountability, and that starts today with ending this $80 billion pay raise. I yield back.
Reserve. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me congratulate Mr. Smith, incidentally, on his recent elevation to become the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. We look forward to a productive session during the next couple of years. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a blog post by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities summarizing the fact check that have repeatedly debunked the false claim that we just heard a few seconds ago that the IRS is going to hire 87,000 new agents immediately, and a factcheck.org article confirming that not all of the 87,000 people that will be hired are going to work on enforcement. With
Without
that,
objection.
A very distinguished member of the Ways and Means Committee is the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Larson, and I yield him 1 minute.
Gentleman from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to associate myself with the remarks of the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts. I think he used the right words when he talked about theater. And isn't it long overdue that we're honest with the American people about what this is about? Come on. You can't really believe that what you're proposing here isn't shielding the wealthiest people in this nation and corporations. People at Augie and Ray's in East Hartford are not fooled by this, and they understand what the agenda is. You place us further in debt and leave us with little else to do to help the people who need it the most. And what is this a guise for? Cutting what you call entitlements. What people in Augie and Ray's know are earned benefits that they pay for every single week out of their paycheck, where they pay their taxes.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman's time has expired. And a reminder to direct your comments to the Speaker. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Nebraska.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman, Ways and Means Committee member, Mr. LaHood from Illinois.
Gentleman from Illinois.
I thank my friend from Nebraska for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of the Family and Small Business Taxpayer Protection Act. This bill defends American taxpayers against an unchecked, supercharged IRS and prioritizes customer service and tax return processing, two of the agency's most important functions. Included in the Democrats' Reckless Inflation Reduction Act this past summer, the IRS received an additional $80 billion in funding, with over half directed towards enforcement. What's worse, the Democrats' bill failed to include any safeguards to protect low and middle income taxpayers from being unfairly targeted for tax audits. While the IRS continues to beef up their audit division, the agency still has 3.7 million unprocessed tax returns and a total of 11.1 million returns awaiting action. This is simply unacceptable. The IRS should focus on processing these returns, along with addressing the awful level of customer service currently available to taxpayers. Law-abiding families and small businesses in Illinois need their tax returns processed and phone calls answered, not more IRS agents knocking on their doors with burdensome audits. I urge the adoption of this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Reserve. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, precisely the point that we've attempted to make. The customer service is not occurring because the IRS has been cut by 30% over the last 15 years. I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a letter from the IRS Commissioner to the House of Representatives confirming that the IRS will not raise audit rates on those making under $400,000 a year.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, a letter from Secretary Yellen to the IRS Commissioner directing the IRS not to use any additional funding to increase audits on small business and households earning less than $400,000 a year.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me yield 1 minute to a very capable member of the Ways and Means Committee, the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Neal, and I appreciate you laid out the facts here. The Family and Small Business Taxpayer Protection Act is a sham. The facts are that this legislation will shield tax cheats at the expense of working families. The last time Republicans were in charge, they systematically defunded IRS. The agency lost nearly 20% of its funding, shed more than 20,000 employees, and the audit rate for millionaires dropped 70%. And we heard one of our Republican colleagues make that point. This legislation will enable those at the top of the heap to be able to remember the taxes they should have reported. It raises, as we've heard, $187 billion in revenue. This bill, if enacted, would add to the deficit $114 billion because it is misguided and misdirected and wrong. I strongly urge the rejection of this legislation and enforcement of the laws for everybody.
Expired. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Nebraska.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Tennessee and a member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Kustoff.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, and I thank the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the Family and Small Business Taxpayer Protection Act. This new Republican majority is focused on protecting taxpayers and small businesses from overreach and abuse. Blocking the Biden administration from unleashing 87,000 new IRS agents on taxpayers is a crucial first step towards fulfilling our commitment to America. This legislation will prohibit the IRS from using new funds to target lower and middle class families and small businesses with more burdensome and intrusive audits. As households grapple with the struggling economy, the last thing they need is more harassment from a supercharged IRS. Republicans are unified in our effort to bring economic relief to Americans, not more government overreach and hardship. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation and stop the administration's weaponizing of the IRS. Thank you, and I yield back.
A reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pasquale, who was sure to offer clarity to this important issue.
Gentleman from New Jersey.
I rise in rigorous opposition to this short-sighted bill, but thank you for allowing us the opportunity to lay the facts on the table. I mean, it's stunning that what you've peddled, those falsehoods,